I was going to be at the casino, and I figured I'd pop in and say hello because I hadn't been here in a while, and happy to talk about anything that's on anyone's mind. Obviously, I suspect one of the things that's on people's minds is the lack of a state budget, which I find infuriating and frustrating at the same time, but not for lack of trying. And I have to say that I was honestly surprised and disappointed that they didn't do a mini budget at the very least, and rather than leave me doing what I have to do under executive order, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But I know that we'll get a budget sooner or later. As I'm fond of saying, every day we're one day closer. I just don't know what day we're one day closer to, but it's a tough proposition for people in serving the legislature to make hard decisions. But this is a time that you have to continue the process of making hard decisions. Something that I have not shied away from. Having said that, I think the CBAC agreement, on top of what we did in 2011, finally puts the state's pension system where it needs to be, including creating now a fourth tier after we had created a third tier in 2011. The significance of that is that by this agreement, because of this agreement and because of demographics, we'll have somewhere between 10 and 16,000 employees in Tier 4 by the end of 2022, which is significant because that's a pension system that is largely driven by the employee contributions as opposed to the state contributions. Although Tier 3 was a vast improvement over prior 1A, and 2, Tier 4 is an entirely different system. And additionally, under that agreement, other arrangements have a total 20-year savings of about $24.5 billion. That's on top of what we did in 2011, which has had billions of dollars, tens of billions of dollars in savings projected over its first 20 years. So the state, long-term wise, is on a much better footing. We now have to make some of those changes, I think, in teachers' retirement as well, to correct that system, which is hanging over the state's financial position. But we also have to get to a budget. And happy to talk about things that might be on anyone's mind.
Yeah, I'll start. The Speaker and his caucus, the House Speaker and the caucus, seem to be the impediment to a temporary budget, or you've called it a mini budget. Is that fair to say? And are you at loggerheads? Are you kind of giving up any expectation that the situation could be addressed with a temporary budget?
Well, I think it's unfair to lay that at the feet of the Speaker. I mean, I've had my differences with the Speaker, but I've had agreements with the Speaker. But, when you have one party saying that they're not going to come to in essence, not going to come to the table to do anything, getting a majority is going to be difficult. And I predicted that it would be difficult. That's why I asked for a mini budget, so that those difficulties would be more tolerable to the state and to the citizenry. On that particular point, the Republican minority leader of the House refused to take up the mini plan on a direct vote, and so the Speaker looked at a long debate that would tie up the House and not lead to, probably would not have led to a mini budget anyway, so he didn't call the question. Quite frankly, I think if he had called the question, it would have indicated the hypocrisy of the minority leader with respect to what she was trying to do on the budget. But nonetheless, he didn't call it. We don't have a mini budget. I was left only one tool, which is executive order, and so far the state's operating relatively well. But there are payments that will be required to be made. First and foremost, or perhaps initially the largest, is education cost sharing. There is no formula for the distribution, and I'm rethinking our initial allocation plan to reflect, to further reflect upon our constitutional requirement that we provide a free public education in the state. There are clearly communities that are in better positioned to provide for that free public education than others. And so by the end of the month, and perhaps sooner, we will put out a new allocation plan with respect to those forms of assistance to municipal government. Got to remember that out of a $20 billion budget, not including federal transportation dollars, about 25% of that goes to local government one way or another, whether it's teacher retirement pension payments, whether it's ECS, whether it's pilot payments, or hospital and colleges payments. It's 25% of the state's operating budget.
Might that allocation plan have the added advantage of being an incentive perhaps for the legislature to actually produce a budget?
I suspect it will. It's one of the things that we can reasonably predict would get us closer to getting a budget at some point, but that's not the reason for the allocation plan. The reason for the allocation plan is we have a constitutional requirement that we provide a free education. That's a lot easier in Waterford than it is New London. That's just the reality. So I have to support the I took an oath to support the Constitution of the state of Connecticut. That's what I intend to do, and I've always put a high premium on public education anyway. And so, having reflected on it, I'll tell people well before the time that the checks go out what they can reasonably expect to receive.
You met last week with the leaders of CCM and the Small Towns Conference, and there would seem to be maybe a potential give and take in that municipalities have for years asked for various mandate reliefs, for some relief on labor rules that they feel would help them better control their costs. And if the state is going to be providing less funding, if, as you want, the towns and cities have to pick up some of the costs of the teacher pensions, can you see a potential, and would you support some kind of trade-off where the legislature provides some of that relief and you would support it? Or
not only do I support it, I had it in my initial budget, and not a single item of the relief structure that I proposed actually got out of committee. And I think there again, when you have one party that says they don't want to have anything to do with the budget, it's hard it's hard to get the folks together on other aspects of what goes into a budget. And I would argue that forms of municipal relief are part of what needs to be reflected in the budget. I've advocated that for years, by the way. That wasn't just this budget, although the program we put forward was far more robust this year than it's ever been in its entirety, but contained things that I'd been trying to do over a number of years. And quite frankly, if Republicans had ever been willing to support any budget, would have been included in any budget they would have presumably supported, including a groundbreaking agreement that we reached with respect to the fiscal year that just ended July 1, and looks to have ended in the black, but we'll have a clearer picture of that in another month or so.
It seems like a long time ago. Could you remind us of a couple of those items that you
Sure. I was,
proposed?
on where certain construction valuation and labor requirements kick in. I was prepared and I've advocated adjusting that to a higher level to reflect construction costs. We've had those rules in place for decades, but we haven't reflected changes in those. Bidding possibilities, a negotiation, or have a single arbitrator as opposed to an arbitration panel of 3, which is very expensive and quite frankly has worked, I think, to distort the system because, labor gets to choose one and that labor vote better vote with labor, and management gets to choose one and that management representative better vote with them, and then you have a single arbitrator. You're distorting the process artificially. I think we should go to a single arbitrator, quite frankly, and I think that would have a positive impact. I'm for collective bargaining. I'm for arbitration. But the system we have, I don't think, works very well for folks.
One school of thought when you announced that you wouldn't be running for re-election was that maybe it would take politics out of the whole process a little bit in Hartford, but listening to you today, it doesn't, you're being critical of the Republicans, which is...
And Democrats. They didn't, Democrats, I criticized the speaker for not calling the question.
Has your announcement had any impact on how things run? Or?
I didn't think it would, and no, I don't think it has. I mean, you got, what do you have, 14 people running for governor? Right? You got people who want to control the House, want to control the Senate. We got a president, for that matter, it took 2 days before he could denounce racism. I mean, we live in a strange world, and politics as they're playing out are different today than they've been in the United States in a long time, and that doesn't excuse the obligation of Republicans and Democrats serving in the House and the Senate of their constitutional requirement to produce a budget. See, I don't produce a budget. I suggest a budget. They have the legal requirement to produce the budget, at which point I have a decision to make whether I'll sign it or not. So Republicans and Democrats are equal failures in their ability to produce a document. This is the first time that they couldn't even get a budget document out of committee that I'm aware of. So, there's plenty of blame to go around, and I understand how difficult it is to tell folks that they're just not going to get what they think they're going to get. I've been telling people that for 7 years.
Lisa? On the teacher's retirement, it looks in a way like a simpler move. It's just transferring who has to pay for it, really. Simpler than what you had to do with the state employees, where you changed the tiers. Am I right? Is it like one of the big stumbling blocks that's keeping this budget from happening?
Yeah, I think that, well, first of all, Connecticut's the only state that funds teachers' pensions the way we do. Mm-hmm. And I can honestly tell you most members of the legislature had no idea how we funded pensions.
I believe
for
that.
teachers. No,
I believe that. Yeah.
But I want to attest. I mean, I have spoken to a generation of people who've served in the legislature, not just the current ones, and they had no idea that we were the only state that did it the way we did. And quite frankly, most of them didn't know that we were the only funder, and municipalities didn't fund at all. And there too, you've seen this distortion of the system, where older or longer term employees end up getting a disproportionate amount of the raise that's negotiated, right, because the systems realize they're only going to pay that for a limited period of time. Right. So your beginning teachers are paid less than they need to be in Connecticut to be competitive as a form of employment. Your older teachers are getting a lot of money, not a lot of money, but more money at the end of their life, in part because those very same 164 districts realize that they're not paying anything for the pension. So what difference does it make?
Right, right.
So it's a very and your retirement's based on where you end, not where you labored for 12 or 13 years, but where you end in your career. It's had this corrosive effect, I think, on our payment schedule, which I think it is making it harder as we speak to hire young teachers in Connecticut. So I just want to correct that. And I'm not looking to shift the state's obligation in the traditional sense. I mean, I acknowledge that the states, with the acquiescence of the teachers' unions and the local governments, didn't properly fund the pension, although I have for years and years and years. And that has a long way to go to do that. What I'm talking about is, what do we do from this point on with respect to the ongoing obligation, not the obligation that's been rolled up for years and years, but the ongoing obligation. And then some of the other things that we need to do, which we've done with the state employee pensions, we need to do with respect to how we're going to fund in a fair way, consistent way, and one that is actuarially representative, that we can actually afford, because there's a gigantic, just as there was until earlier this year in the state pension system, there is this crazy cliff that the state will never be able to honor. So let's deal with that in the context of straightening out this whole problem. I want to get that done by the time I have left. I want the state's teachers' pensions obligations fixed, and I want the state employees' obligations problem fixed. And quite frankly, we've got one. Let's get the other one.
So By transferring a percentage in this year's budget to the towns, would that do it for you with that particular?
Well, I think that I have offered. Listen, you don't make big proposals without the knowledge that you have to negotiate
You're gonna bargain
and bargain it with my counterparts in the legislature, who have basically not bargained. So. I like you a lot. I just don't think this is the place that we should negotiate that settlement. But I do believe that for existing and future employees, that obligation should be the employee and the district. And with respect to the accumulated deficit, I understand that the state is largely responsible for that. Although I will point out, with the active acquiescence of the teachers' unions and the local governments. Right. The local governments loved getting that extra money each year based on the fact that the state wasn't properly funding its pensions. Let's be honest.
Okay, thank you.
Kind of a two-part question following up on that. One of the criticisms of the original proposal was that municipal obligation for the teacher pensions would increase dramatically in future years. And the other question is, are you getting any headway, any suggestion that the legislation might be willing to entertain support, local support for the teacher pensions?
So I think that there's a realization developing that this has to be addressed somehow if we're to have a budget. And I've never refused to negotiate any item that's in the budget. And I came to understand what the fears of the communities were, quite frankly. The local community's position is that's okay for the state to have to go through that. We shouldn't have to go through that. I understand and accept, as I've stated, that the state has been duplicitous in the past with respect to the unfunded portion of that pension obligation. So I am concentrating on what do we do about the present. I understand what the past means. What do we do about the present? And let's go forward.
So to the original concern that when you look at how that plays out,
I think that can be addressed.
It's more and more okay.
I think that can be addressed. And if it gets more and more because systems are paying teachers more and more, that's different than more and more because we're expecting them to make up the long-term deficit. So we could reach an agreement. First, people have to decide they want to reach an agreement, and that decision, other than in my case, hasn't been made.
Republicans were united against the negotiations for the...
only after they were finished. They didn't come out and say we were never going to support anything.
When it came to a vote.
Only when it came to a vote.
They were against it.
You
see any prospects of some bipartisan support to get a state budget approved, or are you looking at the Democrats having to hold together to get a budget passed?
I believe as we get into fall or bigger fear, we get into winter without a budget, that folks will understand how damaging that is, and I hope that they'll come forward on a bipartisan basis, or at least a number of folks will come forward on a bipartisan basis to get the job done. Receiving less money is better than receiving no money. And I think that that's a reality that will play itself out in the coming weeks and months in Connecticut. I just have limited ability to keep the operations of government going by executive order. I can't set tax rates. I can't set I can't recognize formulas that don't exist. That's certainly the case in ECS. I can't, we're losing money every day that there isn't a budget, and that's going to make things more difficult for people. And I think we're not Illinois. We won't go for 3 or 4 years without a budget, but we've already gone further than I think was wise.
Are you surprised it got to this point?
No.
No?
What I was surprised at is that people didn't universally support a mini budget, quite frankly. And I think I've explained how that played itself out in the House, because clearly it would have passed in the Senate. That is interesting at this point. But not. Am I surprised? You know, I made a conscious decision. Let me go back to this. That I wasn't going to require the people of Connecticut to pay an instantaneous price for their leadership having failed to get a budget. Which is why I didn't close the parks, for instance, in the summer season, when they actually all the income that the parks generate is made in the summer. I had no desire to be Chris Christie when it came to people's vacation plans. But there are limitations into what we can do absent a budget or formulas, and so be it. Now, having said that, I believe it's time to get a budget. So I'm hopeful that between now and sometime in October we'll do just that. I'm hopeful.
One way, in fact, often the way Connecticut dealt with these difficult choices before was to put off obligations for another day and another legislature, another governor. In your case, if some things were put off, that would be for another governor, because this is your last 2-year budget. You know, is there any bend on that? You would be willing to delay some of these obligations and let another governor?
If I was going to delay pain, I would have done it the first year, not the last year and a half. I would have done it the first budget. You know me now, and you know that I'm not doing that sort of stuff. And won't do that sort of stuff, and won't let other people do that sort of stuff, and that's what's made things very difficult for folks. You know, as I said on another subject matter, I have no desire to leave office with any political capital. You know, whatever political capital you leave office with is because you didn't spend it on appropriate things, and whether it's criminal justice reform or straightening out teachers and state employee pensions and benefit packages, or properly funding municipalities that can't fund themselves. Those are all things that I am going to continue to work on every day that I'm governor, and I'm not going to kick the can down the road. That's what got us into this trouble to begin with. I mean, I am the only governor in Connecticut's history to fully fund on an actual basis the pension obligation, a pension system that was established over 80 years ago. You know, I'm not leaving all of it. I haven't worked as hard as I have for the last 6.5, 7 years to not finish the job.
Groton, should Groton be nervous? They took quite a whack on the education side in your initial budget proposal. They felt the administration didn't fairly calculate. In fact, they have like 1,000 kids of military personnel in there, and while they have wealthy sections, they're not universally a wealthy town. So what would you say to the Groton folks as you prepare to figure out how to fund education without a budget?
Well, Groton has an equalized net grand list per capita of $136,941 as of 2016. Let's just see what New London's is like. New London's per capita grand list is 67,000. So let's look at Groton's educational system is now 9.44% smaller. In other words, they've lost 855 full-time equivalents during the time since 2011 in their system, and yet. Let's look at New London. New London's population is up 12.78%. New London's total expenditures.
I think if you compare anyone to New London, though, it's going to be, you know, pretty favorable to New London. How about Groton versus Stonington, or Groton versus? Let's
see if I have Stonington. Stonington doing very well for itself, 198,000 per capita. Actually, 199,000 per capita. Its school system is 10.53% smaller than it was in 2011, and yet we have something called hold harmless, so that no matter how much you shrink, you get the same amount of money. And we have a formula, which I have complained about routinely, that doesn't reflect the job that communities are called upon to disproportionately educate those living in poverty in our state. That falls largely on about 30 school districts, and within that, largely, again, with about 10 of those districts. And it seems to me that any fair ECS formula should reflect that requirement and that obligation. And in fact, reflect what the grand list on a per capita basis is for a community, because that's how you raise your money. It's $1,000 for every $1,000 of value as a mill. Groton's mill rate is 22. So let's answer your question about New London. Is 40. That disparity shouldn't be supported on an ongoing basis by its state government. We need a formula that reflects who's doing the hard work on the smallest grand list basis, and impacted by other things. For instance, the idea that Groton educates a lot of service personnel's children, I think that's a reasonable discussion item. I don't have a problem with that at all. But let us also understand that a very substantial number of those people living in Groton are part of the tax base because they're on assignment to Electric Boat or at the base. So I mean, these things, it is absolutely something that should be taken into consideration. I have no problem doing that.
So when you said you were going to, by the end of the month, have something more on this, and you're making this constitutional obligation a big priority, is this your main thing to do now? I mean, is that what you're really thinking, is fix education before the end?
I think that it's one of the things.
Yeah.
I think that the second CBAC agreement that we reached was part of those things. I mean, if I had to say what are the most important things, getting the state's long-term fiscal health to where it is sustainable, and that clearly we could do that in the biennium budget. We could clearly do that in the biennium budget. Criminal justice reform continues to be an issue that I work on every day, and quite frankly, educational improvement. I'm proud of the fact that we now have a graduation rate that's higher than at any time in our state's history, or that all 11th graders have access to the SAT, and that 92% of them took the SAT, or 95? And 95% took the SAT, and that we have pretty strong rankings in things like literacy, reading abilities, and the like. And that most of that improvement, by the way, came about in those 30 lowest performing districts. And that something like 2/3 of those districts outperformed the improvement on a statewide basis.
So to just kind of close the loop on that, it sounds like your philosophy that the towns and city that can afford to should pay more towards their education, and that if student population is declining, you shouldn't be held harmless with the amount of money you receive. It sounds like you're prepared to carry out that philosophy in the funding that you'll allocate in the absence of a budget?
Well, there is no ECS formula. It expired. I don't think members of the legislature were paying attention to that, but the way they had written the budget previously was the ECS formula expired. It needs to be replaced. It was funny. One of the unions came out and said we shouldn't change the ECS formula. Well, we don't have one.
But you said that in the beginning, didn't you?
I did.
Beginning of the year?
Yeah, I did.
Okay.
But not everything frequently I'm the only person listening to me.
I heard that.
So, but I mean, listen, I think we need to do more with less. As I sit here today, state government is at least 12% smaller than it was the day I got sworn in. If you polled your readers, they would have probably all say state government's gotten bigger while Dan Malloy's been governor. Well, that's just the opposite. It's 12% smaller.
Is that number of employees or budget?
It's the number of executive employees. I'm measuring it by employees. Yeah. 12 somewhere between 12 and 13% smaller, and it will continue to get smaller, in part because we've made wise investments in technology that have been underinvested in, so that our employees are doing more with less time.
You said you don't want to lead with higher and newer taxes and
Right.
increased revenue, but you haven't drawn any lines in the sand as to what you would consider to generate revenue. The House is out of the House. There was a proposal for a pretty big boost in the sales tax up to 6.99%. I guess they wanted to avoid that 7%. Can you kind of help us out and help the readers out as to where you stand right now and what your tolerance level would be on the revenue side?
Well, I haven't publicly, or for that matter privately, said I won't do X, Y, or Z. I've said it's be very difficult for me to do X, Y, or Z, but I haven't said I won't, because I think I have approached discussions about the budget understanding that I've got to be in a position to move, and other people need to be in a position to move. But Republicans have said they have no intention of supporting a budget. Democrats have been unable to cobble together the votes necessary to get it out of either house. I don't think the Senate is likely to get out large tax increases, even if I was supportive of them, which I am not. Having said that, there are revenue changes. We have something that I've said should no longer be in existence, particularly in light of some of the things that we've done with an earned income tax credit and capping car property taxes and actually lowering them in a lot of places. The idea that we send out a whole bunch of checks for $80 doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Now that could be up to $200, but the average is $80, which means that a good portion of that property tax system is actually supporting people's not paying any car tax. So effectively. So it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So that's a revenue item that doesn't change a rate, but allows us to identify monies that could be used to make sure that we provide the services necessary we provide. I've made those suggestions, but routinely they've been batted away.
What's going to happen with your transportation plans?
Well, listen, we're spending hundreds of millions of dollars over here on this bridge because it's the right thing to do. We're designing projects that will be ready. I think one of my frustrations when I became governor is we went to the cabinet to look for projects that were ready to go, particularly transportation related, and they had actually stopped designing those things years ago. So they weren't ready to go. Mm-hmm. We've rebuilt that department, although it's substantially smaller today than it was. We will have those projects ready to go. We currently are committed 0.5 cent of our sales tax to transportation. That gets us part of the way. On the other hand, we can't we can't be ostriches as a state for the rest of our existence. Gas taxes income is declining,
right?
And unless you do something like changing how we raise money for transportation, or increasing rates, or some combination, anyone's transportation plan will be unaffordable, because we know that the national contribution is not going up either. So if the national contribution is not going up and your income stream, or a good percentage of your income stream, is shrinking, then we have to answer certain questions. That's why I was willing to sign that budget in a couple of years ago that actually set aside 0.5 cent of the sales tax to support transportation. We have mega projects coming on. I mean, I have said that I-95 from Greenwich border through Stonington needs to be it needs to be an additional lane. Where it's 3, it needs to be 4. Where it's 2, it needs to be 3. Bridges need modernization. Super systems like I-84 through Hartford are going to fall down. We're actually in the midst of what probably will have to be the last major repairs of those structures, because it's now beyond its life expectancy. And it was designed to carry 40,000 cars a day, and it now carries 170,000 cars a day. This thing's going to fall down. It's in essence an elevated bridge that wasn't built to handle that kind of traffic. Mixed master in Waterbury, which means probably nothing to most folks in your readership, but this is a strangely designed system. It's going to fall down. There are these needs, and my predecessors as governor, and this is more my predecessors than the legislature, because the job of a governor is to lead and to show the people of a state the tough decisions that they need to collectively make. Well, with systems that are falling down and clearly not meeting the needs, I mean, we're not getting our share of New York City's exodus jobs anymore, because no one believes in New York that we're going to do what we need to do on or didn't believe that we were going to do what we needed to do on transportation. I think there's a recognition now that we're making some improvements, particularly on rail, that are winning some support there. But for most of the time that I've been governor, we got chartered in Connecticut. We got navigators to move out of New York City. We got some other jobs to move out in New York City. But it was nothing like the period from 1995 to 2001 when I first portion of my time as mayor of Stamford, when on a regular basis we were seeing the transference of jobs out of New York to a less costly center. We're still less costly, just can't get here.
So I keep saying this to everybody who will listen. I do not understand why the legislature doesn't think tolls would be good, for one really important reason. It would introduce a whole new bunch of taxpayers. It would add people to the pool.
About 30% of whom do not live in the state.
That's what I mean. People who are not helping us pay for that road in most other ways, even if they buy gas in the state once in a while. And they don't.
If you're a trucker.
I also understand that the tourism caucus, or not the caucus, the coalition, is going to come roaring back talking about how you get $3 for each $1 that you spend. And again, you need to recognize that if they are coming in here, they're more than likely in their own cars.
Right.
Why aren't we getting ready to have tolls in Connecticut?
Well, in part because the legislature wouldn't do what they needed to do years ago, and that was to do a constitutional lockbox, which finally they've put on the ballot for 2018. And I think that Connecticut citizens had more than appropriate reasons to be skeptical of what the legislature would do with any new revenue if the people of Connecticut, through their elected officials, was to grant that. So I look forward to a discussion in the remaining days of my time as governor and into the future about how do we make up for this deficit, which I've described to you, which is with more and more alternative energy vehicles, or quite frankly, no carbon vehicles, one of the largest parts of our funding system is going away, and it's going away rapidly. I was with Elon Musk a couple of weeks ago down in Rhode Island. He spoke to the National Governors Association, and he predicted that within 10 years, a majority of vehicles produced will actually be battery operated. A majority. And he said, and obviously it will take a long period of time, but eventually combustion engines on vehicles will be the rough equivalent, modern day equivalent of owning a horse.
That's a good thing.
But think about it. I mean, so your whole funding source goes away. Not the whole thing, but a gigantic portion of it.
The part that makes up.
So we have to have that discussion. But we had a legislature that wouldn't meet the people of the state of Connecticut halfway and put on the ballot the question of if we're going to have a discussion about what we fund transportation, how do we make sure that whatever we agree to do is actually going to go for transportation? And that's one of the things I've produced. At least it will be on the ballot. The House Republicans prevented that from being on the ballot in 2016.
Okay.
The lead story in The Economist this week is the cover story, "The End of the Internal Combustion Engine."
Is
their lead story.
Well, but it was this amazing discussion with Elon about combustion engineering, and eventually combustion engines will be like owning a horse. But people have it, and they can write it for transportation purposes, but no one really does.
Among the planks in President Trump's platform when he was running for president was a massive infrastructure program, and we haven't seen any progress yet, but could that potentially be a significant game change for Connecticut if the federal government was to invest?
When he was talking about that, were his lips moving? Because his initial plan is $200 billion. $200 billion is not a massive plan.
I think it was $1 trillion when he was talking about it.
Yeah. His proposal, yes, it's $1 trillion. It's $200 million from federal government, and everything else is going to come from someone else. Well, that's not a plan. I give Schumer some credit. He's actually put out a plan, and I don't always agree with Senator Schumer, but at least he's put out a plan that makes sense and is a big ticket item. Now, I think. Changing our corporate tax structure, reshoring offshore profits could play a role, but ultimately the federal government has not changed the tax rate on a gallon of gas or a gallon of diesel since 1993. They're facing the same funding vacuum that we're facing, and they're even less likely to deal with that in the coming years. So their ability to fund this sort of thing is going away very rapidly. So I first of all, $200 billion is not a lot. We've calculated that that Connecticut probably has to spend half of that over the next 30 years. So you could do Rhode Island and Connecticut and Massachusetts for maybe 200.
While we have you here, you announced an executive order to take a hard look at the fiscal and pricing situations affecting Millstone nuclear plant. We've had bills the last 2 sessions that haven't passed to provide them some pricing relief that they said they're needed. Some have characterized Dominion's reaction as a cold shoulder. They say, no, we don't really have time for another study. We need to address this now. And we hear there could potentially be something in a special session. From the administration's point of view, where do things stand, vis-a-vis Dominion and Millstone?
I think Dominion's done a bad job, quite frankly, of having this discussion with the people of Connecticut because they're unwilling to share any information. So it's, we're asked to trust them when, quite frankly, every national publication or opinion that I've seen about nuclear say that these are the two of the most profitable reactors in the country. I thought, and by the way, let me point out that on the last session day, Dominion was actively trying to get a study bill done, and I was helping. And in fact, it got through one house, or was ready to get through one house when the other house wouldn't take it up. I think the Senate was ready to we can get you the actual, but whether they were, it would have passed the Senate. The House didn't take it up as I'm remembering, but we could put it together for you.
I think that's true.
Dominion didn't even come to talk to me about this issue until about 10 days before the end of the session. Now, they did several years ago when I said, hey, we need transparency, we need exchange of information, we need to understand, what difficulties you are or not under. I certainly want to see it preserved in Connecticut if it can be, but at what price? What's an appropriate price or subsidy to keep the non-carbon energy being produced in Connecticut? So I did an executive order. Pure has opened the docket. It's got a very short timeline, and a report's expected by the next session. And I hope that they'll comply with our request for information so that we can help them in an appropriate way. I think anyone looking at what we're doing would say that that's a reasonable way to proceed. I think anyone looking at Dominion's reaction with respect to sharing information would say, boy, that's just not fair. It's not fair. And so I think we need to come together on this issue. And I've tried. I mean, I think we labored mightily on that executive order. I'm happy to tell you. And I was very involved. First of all, it was my idea. I told my staff, and I made a number of the edits to that order specifically. And no one has said, other than Dominion, that that's not a substantial step in the right direction. No one else has said that. And I don't think it's going to get taken up on in a special session.
Okay.
I don't see that there's a consensus to do that. I think Dominion should work with the people of Connecticut to resolve any difficulties that are faced by the operation of the two nuclear reactors in Connecticut. I think they should work with us.
Why don't you think there's consensus to bring it up?
Just because there's not enough information having been provided. And then how does that, who pays for that? Is it really lower rates or is it higher rates? What's the nature of the difficulties? They want a 5-year agreement in place. Well, what if the dynamics of the marketplace change next year? Should they be able to continue to cash in? I understand if they go further south, they'll probably be looking for more relief. But let's assume that the dynamics of natural gas change very quickly. We have more polar vortex, which, by the way, cost the Connecticut $5.2 billion several years ago. But let's say that becomes a more regular phenomenon. They're not proposing that relationship should be changed at that point, should that happen, right? So I mean, it's been very much about a one-way discussion. Now, I am open to helping. I want to be very clear. I believe that carbon-free energy is important in this time, particularly when we have a president who denies that humankind is having an impact on the climate. So, you had me at hello, but now we got to close the deal and figure out what the deal should look like. And that's why I've asked Pura to open the docket, which they've done, and gave them a very short time frame in which to make a report, and asked them to garner all the information necessary to make recommendations. I think it's kind of reasonable.
Yeah, if the legislature surprised you and did put something on your desk, you'd be receiving it before your own study was done. What would be the implications of that?
I have no expectation that that's going to happen. They were roundly defeated. There was no consensus to do anything for them. That's what the consensus was, right? And then when it was changed to a study bill, there was a consensus developed in the Senate that they should pass that. But it still didn't, not even a study bill got called. So what did I do? I issued a study order. It's pretty good. But
reportedly,
for a group of people who wouldn't talk to me.
But reportedly, in magical ways we haven't been told, somehow there'd be a revenue enhancer, and the consensus is that anything that creates revenue, the legislature will be excited to look at.
Yeah, well, it's a tax. Revenue's tax. So who pays the tax, right?
Usually those are passed along.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, let's be honest. That's what it is. So in essence, apparently, and I have no knowledge of this other than what I've read in the paper. So I've not been involved in any discussions, but it's been reported that Dominion is offering money to the legislature should they mandate such a system as they've previously requested without their having to give over the kinds of information that they need to. That means ratepayers will pay as a rate a higher amount, and it will be an undisclosed tax to individuals. Generally speaking, I'm not in favor of that sort of thing. I think whatever we tax, we should disclose.
It seems as though if Pura can't pressure them, at least by making it clear how uncooperative they are, that the whole thing at the end is going to be even less interested in the legislature in helping them than there is now. And maybe there should be. But I'm wondering if the Pura and Deep hearings would sort of force their hand at some point.
I think they're... I think there's a reason to have a tool in the toolbox,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
That should certain things happen or are projected to happen, that there's something we can do. I think that's the discussion we should be having. Quite frankly, it's the discussion we should have had 2 years ago and should have had this past year. But Dominion was unwilling to have that discussion.
Right.
And, you know, it's the rough equivalent of somebody saying, if you don't do what I want, I'm going to shoot my dog.
Okay.
Kind of to any other questions?
On another local issue, you and the state committed money to the Coast Guard Museum, and the federal government has also, but it seems the private sector has been a little slow to respond to fundraising. Does that disappoint you at all?
Yeah, I'm not as up on it as you are, to tell you the truth. Our money would be available whenever this is ready to go. Quite frankly, I'd like to pay it over while I'm governor. So I'm ready to move forward. I don't know exactly where they are on the private fundraising side. I think it's hard to raise money for a facility that there's not an agreement on exactly where it's going to be built and what it's going to look like. And so I'm not sure that we should cast aspersions, and you're not. I don't. But I'm not sure I would point fingers at the fundraising side until, you know, the DEP, which is our state agency, the town, everybody can get on board with where it's exactly going to be and what it's going to look like and how it can be built. Then I think you go to the private sector. I was heartened to see a different approach at the federal side, since they have supported museums of this nature elsewhere. There was no reason to exclude the Coast Guard from receiving those kinds of funds, and that seems to have been addressed, and I think it probably will be addressed further. So that's a very good sign. But I very much would like to pay the money over to the appropriate parties, or at least have appropriated the money, so it's sitting and ready and available to them, and I intend to do it while I'm governor.
I'm curious, there were two recent think pieces. One was in the Atlantic, one was in the National Review, essentially with the title, like, What's Wrong with Connecticut? They talk about the budget issues, but they also talked about Connecticut sort of having a lack of a cultural center, and, you know, when Connecticut was, spent a lot of money on its suburbs, but now that younger people are interested in living cities, Connecticut has sort of abandoned its cities. And I think there was a study last week or the week before about a lot of young people are still leaving Connecticut. Can you sort of weigh in on that, or what you see as the future of Connecticut?
It's a very complicated issue. For instance, we have a very highly successful city, Stamford. They had a very interesting mayor for 14 years, who made the kinds of investments in that city to make it more attractive to the demographic you're talking about. I mean, you build 7,000 units of housing in a relatively short period of time, specifically designed to address the needs of younger people. Don't be surprised if people occupy it. And you lower crime, and you improve education, and you build a transportation system, at least within the city, that works. Don't be surprised that people reward you for that. But that's not what we've done with respect to our other, and in this case, poorer cities. Hartford didn't see that level of investment, and certainly not. I mean, they built a convention center, but they didn't build housing. They didn't build a modern transportation system. Same thing in New Haven, same thing in Bridgeport, same thing in Waterbury, same thing in Torrington, same thing in New London. What's happened in Brooklyn didn't happen overnight. It was a sustained effort to change Brooklyn. And to change parts of Manhattan that weren't benefiting, and to change parts of the Bronx that weren't benefiting. There were a large-scale and transportation improvements that were required. I pointed out a different side of the coin. I mean, I've served state or local government since 1995 in a chief elected position for all but 1 year, either as mayor or governor. We have not seen the level of transportation investment that was ongoing in Boston, ongoing in New York City, ongoing in Massachusetts, the Commonwealth, ongoing in the whole state of Connecticut, or New Jersey for that matter. I mean, New Jersey built a parallel highway system without anybody noticing it. So what was once a 6-lane highway is 12 to 20 lanes. We didn't do anything. So don't be surprised. And by the way, we didn't make improvements to the rail system. So don't be surprised that you can't cash in on lifestyle changes if you didn't invest to cash in on lifestyle changes. And Connecticut is very much in a playing a catch-up role. When I became governor, we didn't have a housing department in Connecticut. We've now committed to 21,000 units of housing. And over half of that's been completed. It's a very different dynamic that exists today in Connecticut. So I think studying current numbers that are based on past practices will give you the result. It will tell you where you are, but it's not a good predictor of where you'll necessarily be. And I think that Connecticut can change, and I think parts of the state have changed. I mean, in Hartford, what are we up to? About 1,500 units of housing in the downtown that have come online in the last 2 years, with another 12 to 2,000 scheduled to do that. Young people need a place to live. And by the way, most apartments now are occupied by one person. It's a different lifestyle. And so we need to build our cities to be competitive for that. But if your tax rate's 77 mils, or in New London's case, 40 mils, how does New London compete with its neighbors who have a tax rate in the teens and a tax rate at 20 mil rate? And New London's problems, there may have been bad decisions made, but we need to make good decisions to turn it around. And there's been a lack over a 50-year period of time in Connecticut to make those decisions, particularly about our urban areas. And I've tried to make a lot of those, and plan on making a lot more of those decisions in the next 18 months. Okay.
Thank you for coming in.
Great, thanks. Good to be with you all. Thank you.